Okay, so this panel's outsider, but also one of this conference's contradictions, because Olson is not a European writer or even an American writer geared towards Europe, like Pound or Eliot. Olson is an American writer, often writing on a particular American place, yet for a global community. He is not a modernist, but a self-declared postmodern poet who wrote most of his work after 1950. Furthermore, judging by the famous opening lines of his first book, Call Me Ishmael, published in 1947, he anticipated the spatial turn the postmodern riposte to the modernists' infatuation with time. So, I take space to be the central fact to man born in America from Folsom Cave to now. I spell it large because it comes large here, large and without mercy. And Olson was a giant poet. He was almost 2 meters tall, and everything is large and bulky in his writings as well. So why are we having this American giant who hated traditional institutions and rallied against the limits of academic discourse here in Leuven's center of old world learning? It is Olson's bracketed not looking at Europe, his contrary stance, that shows us, or can show us, the blind spots in vanguard experiment with time, and important for Olson in history. So Olson's critique of old world writing and thinking, vanguard and bohemian as that may proclaim itself to be, points to issues we as 21st century modernist critics may still have to work through. So history is Olson's central project. The space he spells large at the beginning of Call Me Ishmael is where, by his account, American history starts. Throughout his writings, this self-labeled poet-historian goes in search of the concrete, the real, as the grounding for a new kind of history writing, in contradiction to the European idealist discourse on the past, the philosophy of history, with all the Hegelian connotations. So I'll be talking about Charles Olson's Mayan letters, a collection of letters he wrote to Robert Creeley, fellow American poet, published in 1953. And these letters deal with the time Olson spent on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, where he was being really enthusiastic about his archaeological adventures, and where he was in search of a profound, a deep historical experience. So in these Mayan letters, Olson stresses the importance of the notion of contradiction, of contrariness. Contradiction for Olson, and he's drawing on William Blake, is a counterforce, not a step in a dialectical process. Contradiction is geared towards difference, not resolution. As he puts it in one of his letters, his goal is to come up with another humanism, for it is so much a matter of resistance, like I tried to say about leaving the difficulties, not removing them. So the European approach to history and the modernist experiment with writing down the past are, for Olson, in dire need of some resistance, of difficulty, of difference. Olson detailed his struggle with this problem of history. What is the past? Where is the past? How can it be made to bear on the present? How can it be, should it be written down in numerous pieces? And famous are the early 1950s essays, Equal, that is, to the Real Itself, Human Universe, and The Special View of History. And in the latter, in the essay The Special View of History, Olson formulates his argument that it is now, after centuries of estrangement, that the time is right for man to be reunited with that with which he should be most familiar, the change and processes that make up life. In this project, man's relation to history is to be radically reconsidered. One should no longer regard history as a collection of past events, as a fate, and in the essay also mocks Mussolini's crying when the troops hit Anzio, "History has got us by the throat." So history not as a collection of past events or as something that we are making today and for the good of the people. No, history rather is energy to be used. It is the intensity of life. It should not speak only of what has been done, but function as a stage for doing or as the stage for doing and saying to reunite. So much like myth and rites go hand in hand. So the time is right for also to couple the regime of discourse installed by the Greeks, this regime of discourse that only allowed for talk about reality as if it is a substance that contains properties to be analysed, counted, compared. And this insight that it is now that we should radically change the way in which we conceive history is due to a 19th century contrary renaissance. In the essay Equal That Is to the Real Itself, Olson stresses how in the 19th century an idea shook loose. With the development of a non-Euclidean geometry, energy and motion became once again key lenses through which to contemplate the world. And Olson credits 19th century mathematicians Bolyai and Lobachevsky, but above all Riemann, with opening our eyes to the continuous aspect of reality, to the fact that reality is always unfinished business. Riemann distinguished between discrete multiplicities, which are determined by the number of their elements, and continuous multiplicities, which are determined by the phenomena unfolding in them, or the forces acting in them. So whereas the former, this discrete multiplicity, in Olson's words, correspond to the old system, the system that includes discourse, language as it had been since Socrates, is how he puts it. The continuous model is the one that is more true. An energetic and differentiating continuity, then, is what Olson, as poet-historian, goes in search of. This kind of continuity is to be distinguished from an evolutionary paradigm in which different stages have led to man as acme. What preoccupies Olson is the idea of a force that is and therefore stays. As he puts it in the Mayan letters, force stays, is, and therefore stays whenever, whatever. That is what we are concerned with. It breaks all time and space. Muy bueno, muy bonito. So such a scheme for Olson makes for a contrary to Western humanism. As he further explains, man as object in field of force, declaring self as force, because is force, so you get Olson thinking here, because is force in exactly such a relation and can accomplish expression of self as force by conjecture and displacement in a context best now seen as space more than a time. Such, which I take it is precise contrary to what we have had as humanism, with man out of all proportion of relations, thus so miscentered, becomes dependent on only a whole series of human references, which so made make only anthropomorphism and thus make much of any reality. So the multiplicities Olson calls for resound with relatively recent insights from theory and criticism. His idea that there isn't something changing into something else but continuous forces in a sense echoes Latour's provocation that we have never been modern. The wish to break with a human-centered world and explore man as force in a field affected by and affecting other forces ties in with the domain of new materialisms. And here, in that field of a new materialism, or that field, as Diana Cool and Samantha Frost, who've edited a collection on new materialism, put it. So, I'm sorry. So Olson anticipates new materialism, and this new materialism views our existence as dependent on microorganisms and higher species. on our own hazily understood bodily and cellular reactions, and on pitiless cosmic motions, on the material artifacts and natural stuff that populate our environment, as well as on socio-economic structures that produce and reproduce the conditions of our everyday lives. So furthermore, Olson's global ambitions, his decision to move to the Yucatan Peninsula in search of what binds post-World War II Americans to the Mayas, tallies with the Deep Time project as it is presented by Dimmock. Dimmock calls for a broader expanse of space and time in thinking about history. And in her essay Deep Time, American Literature and World History, she, for example, argues that the continuum of historical life does not grant the privilege of autonomy to any spatial locale. It does not grant that privilege of autonomy to any temporal segment. Periodization, she stresses, is no more than a fiction. Periodization offers a linear chronology, segments of time neatly sliced, neatly sequenced, neatly segregated, taken to be discretely analyzable. But such segments can never fully taxonomize the world. Historical processes are not all sliced in this way. They do not all march in a single file. They cannot all be boxed into fixed slots. So world history, by Dimmock's account, begins with extended and non-standardized duration. What would happen, she asks, if we were to reckon time by something other than the routine century-long periods? What would the world look like if we were to use a different scale, a different temporal taxonomy, a different way of cutting and slicing time? And these questions are very much in tune with Olson's project. In more than mere thought exercises, these questions come with an important ethical dimension. So where Dimmock wants literary studies to break with American racist modernity in the sense of its geographically determined American canon, Olson urges us to keep racism at the end of the stick. In responding to those scholars who seek to pinpoint the origins of civilization, he writes, until we have completely cleaned ourselves of the biases of Westernism, of Greekism, until we have squared away at historical time in such a manner that we are able to see Sumer as a point from which all races, speaking of them culturally, not biologically, address, we do not have permission to weight the scale one way or another. Now, Olson in the 1950s was not alone in expanding space and time when thinking about history, where Dimmock builds on Brodell's longue durée and Emanuel Wallerstein's world system. Olson actually adds a bibliography to the Mayan letters, telling us on whose work he draws. So among those writers and books that have inspired him to give the Maya the present they once were and are, he includes Brooks Adams, even if eventually any of his work is boring, supposedly, Leo Frobenius, Jane Harrison, anything of hers, he tells us, the classic author Pausanias, a 2nd century AD writer, because of the careful localism in his description of Greece. Also Ezra Pound's Guide to Culture, because it razzle-dazzles history. And importantly, Carl Sauer's article Environment and Culture in the Deglaciation. So that was Sauer. In this essay, or this essay for Olson, amounts to the single gate to the remote past. And in the piece, Sauer concludes this piece with the claim that there is no general succession of cultural stages. Against the theory of independent parallel invention, the historian favors the idea of cultural diffusion. Time by itself, Sauer writes, works no social evolution of large proportion. What matters in thinking about human learning and the ways in which it has progressed is to take into account the factors of both relative shelter from the outside world and stimulating communication with that outside world. And that insight, so the necessity of communication with the outside world is where for Olson the modernist projects of Pound and William Carlos Williams essentially failed. Now Olson, he set himself a difficult challenge. He wanted to do what Sowell was doing, go way back to the mid-Pleistocene or to the Maya civilization, and show that it is our kind that stretches all the way back. But he wanted to do so in poetry, for poetry. And central to poetry, Olson explains in his manifesto Projective Verse, is a stance that places the poet among the things in his world, a stance he calls objectism. So not objectivism, but objectism, again this idea of contrariness there. So objectism, according to Olson, is the getting rid of the lyrical interference of the individual as ego, of the subject and his soul, that peculiar presumption by which Western man has interposed himself between what he is as a creature of nature and those other creations of nature, which we may, with no derogation, call objects. So in approaching history via poetry, Olson again was not alone. But in the Mayan letters, he shows himself a very critical reviewer of his modernist predecessors and their ambitions to make new history. None of them, it seems, are good objectists. In his letter to Creeley of 8 March, Olson reviews his predecessors, the modernist writer-historians Ez, Pound, Joyce and William Carlos Williams. So Pound's cantos, he finds, solves the problem of freeing historical material from chronologies and traditional discourse by his ego. So this is Olson on Pound. His single emotion breaks all down to his equals or inferiors. So far as I can see, only 2 possibly are admitted by him to be his betters, Confucius and Dante. Which assumption that there are intelligent men whom he can out-talk is beautiful because it destroys historical time and thus creates the methodology of the cantos, a space field where by inversion, though the material is all time material, is driven through it so sharply by the beak of his ego that he has turned time into what we must now have, space and its live air. Pound, in other words, razzle-dazzles history by egocentrically appropriating the past and talking his way through it. Joyce, by contrast, for Olson, is stuck in the Irish past. So this is Olson on Joyce. Joyce did not improve on Duns Scotus. All the Irish of the time, the Irish were the culture bosses. What was it, 7th, 9th century or something? He tried to get at the problem by running one language into another so as to create a universal language of the unconscious, which is finally, again, mush and shit. That is now, not so then, for then Europe was both in language and dream of that order. More interesting than Joyce to compare Pound's cantos to is William Carlos Williams's Patterson. So Olson writes, the primary contrast for our purposes is Bill. His epic poem Patterson, is exact opposite of Ez's. That is, Bill has an emotional system which is capable of extensions and comprehensions. The ego system, the old deal, is not. Yet by making his substance historical of one city, the Joyce deal, Bill completely licks himself, lets time roll him under as Ez does not, and thus, so far as what is the most important, methodology, contributes nothing, in fact delays, deters and hampers by not having busted through the very problem which Ez has so brilliantly faced and beat. So where Pound is able to free historical material but still clings to an old humanism and restricts his perspective to the Western box, Williams's method of confounding speaker and city in Patterson moves into the direction of Olson's objectivist force field, yet ultimately fails because it sticks to narrating the development of one modern American city. Now what about Olson's own poetry? In the Mayan letters, he repeatedly expresses his fascination with the Mayan hieroglyphs. So So in a letter of March 20th, he writes, Christ these hieroglyphs. Here is the most abstract and formal deal of all things this people dealt out, and yet to my taste it is precisely as intimate as verse is in fact verse, is their verse. And in the essay Human Universe, written during his time in Yucatan, we read, we have lived long in a generalizing time, at least since 450 BC, and it has had its effects on the best of men, on the best of things. Logos, or discourse, for example, has in that time so worked its abstractions into our concept and use of language that language's other function, speech, seems so in need of restoration that several of us go back to hieroglyphs or to ideograms to write the balance. So the distinction here is between language as the act of the instant and language as the act of thought about the instant. So where Pound turned to the Chinese ideograms, Olson focused on the Mayan hieroglyphs as a source of inspiration for writing that is bound up with the world and its things, its objects, its forces. The Mayan letters, as a collection of letters, do not contain a lot of poetry. And as an afterthought to the correspondence, Olson adds, the trouble is, it is very difficult to be both a poet and a historian. And yet Olson faced that difficulty in his masterpiece, the Maximus poems, a city epic like Williams's Patterson, and a poem that razzle-dazzles history like Pound's cantos. The poem's feat, and it's strange to call it a poem, it's an epic, is that it combines Williams's method of connecting self with outside world and Pound's irreverent approach to chronology and historical sequence. So Maximus, Olson's poetic hero, explores a vertical dimension. Yes, he's concerned with the history of a city, Gloucester, but while roaming this city, he finds out that an instant is not a mechanical duration, but a coincidence of consciousness and space, which can be concentrated or expanded infinitely by use. So this insight enables him to delve into deep time and connect the multiplicity that is Gloucester to more expansive multiplicities, to make contact with the 13th century of Saint Anthony, the patron saint of the Portuguese fishing community in Gloucester. Also to get the community in touch with the Indian will which the West, according to Olson, the West had lost the law of. Also to see from the vantage of the birds he marveled at on the Yucatan Peninsula, the birds which he associates with Maya culture. So where in Human Universe we read, it was better to be a bird as these Maya seem to have been. They kept moving their heads so nervously to stay alive, to keep alerted to what they were surrounded by. He opens the Maximus poems in this way. So again, the analogy, or you see the way in which he's thinking about Maya culture and birds informs his Maximus poems. So Olson's stance of supreme alert to what surrounds us proved a fruitful poetic method. Maximus is a masterpiece. But it is also, I think, an important critical stance because it demands contrariness. It demands we dig deep, that we take the way of the lowest, that we go contrary. It urges us, in other words, to keep in mind that European modernism 1900-1950 is not an actual slice of history. It's surrounded and affected by places and times we should not forget. Thank you.